Hey guys, my name is Javier Perez, and I'm currently a senior material artist at PlayStation Visual Arts Service Group. I've been in the industry for about 9 years now, and in this lesson, we'll be diving into the flood fill node within Substance Designer. I'm not necessarily going to show you guys how to create a full-on material, but more so dive into the details of what the flood fill is, what can it do, and how it can add some much more variation onto our tiling patterns within Substance Designer. So let's get started. So to begin, in our last lesson, we went over how to create different tiling patterns. So to get started with the flood fill, I'm just going to open that last file, but anyone else, you guys can just create any sort of pattern within Substance Designer using any of the tile generators. But I'm just opening the old file that we used in the last video so we can just get a head start on some different things that we can do within this guy. So let's see, I'm going to choose... Let's try this one that we did earlier. So this one's just a basic kind of brick pattern. So I'm just going to plug this guy in. And I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy. And I'm actually going to copy this and then paste it. And then we can rename this into Flood Fill Demo. Cool. So to bring up the flood fill node, all we have to do is just start searching for your different nodes, and we're going to bring in the flood fill node. Now, by itself, it's not necessarily made to be used by itself. You'll notice what happens when we plug in any tiling pattern into this guy. We're going to get these different kind of colors and different gradient values. And with this, you're not going to get much out of it. You're supposed to plug this into one of the many other flood fill nodes that there are within Substance Designer. So we have the flood fill to B-box, color, gradient, grayscale, position, etc. One other thing to note about the flood fill is that we have to have kind of these outlines within our pattern that we plug in. So for example, if one of these was touching or something like that, so basically if the pattern was kind of broken. So let's just, I'll show you guys what happens when we bring in a different flood fill, and I'm just gonna break the tiling on this guy. So I'm just gonna bring a regular shape in here, and I'm gonna do a blend. Bring this guy in, bring this guy in. I'm gonna change this to just like a circle or something. Bring down the scale. And I'm just going to blend this guy into like something like this. So once we add this guy into this flood fill, you can kind of see what's going to happen. So basically all the different bricks within that range, so any bricks touching this kind of interior circle, what the flood fill is looking for solid black lines within your pattern. So it doesn't actually have to be black and white. You can still use a grayscale kind of value like we do here. But if we had some connecting lines in between these guys, it might work, but just keep in mind if we start getting some weird colors like this, watch out and make sure that you have always connecting lines within this guy. One other thing to note is that sometimes when you first load in the flood fill node, you might not see it how I see it currently in the 2D view, and that's because we have to turn on the show checkerboard, and that'll give us these nice kind of gradations and colors that you see here. So just make sure to show the checkerboard. If not, you're gonna get just kind of this opacity looking transparent thing, kind of what we have here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and delete this stuff right now. So now that we have this guy on its own, let's go ahead and see what the different options are that we can plug this guy into. So again, we have the color, gradient, grayscale, position, random color, etc. So the first one I want to show you guys is the gradient. Now, I'm just going to plug this guy in, and you can instantly see what's going to happen. We're going to get these different gradient values within our pattern. Now, doing this, if we had just started with this and try to add gradient values, it might be a little bit kind of difficult to get the different gradients within this guy. But with the flood fill node, it's processing everything, and then we're able to just get gradients onto just our bricks. Now, the one thing that we're going to use this guy for is to get some nice kind of variation when the light hits on the normals. So I'm actually going to turn on the tessellation on this guy first. That way we can kind of see what's going to happen. So I'm just going to bump this guy up, bring up the scale. And already we do have some nice kind of variation because we do have these grayscale values. But one thing you'll notice is that they're all pretty much on the same plane. So they're all laying flat. Now, if we just plug this guy in, we can kind of see what'll happen. So instantly, because we have these gradients on this tiling pattern, we have the whites to the blacks. We're getting the peaks of the white going to this black, and they're all going in the same direction. And that's because within the settings of the gradient, we have a few different things that we can play with. My favorite one is to use the angle variation. And what this angle variation does is that it's going to give the gradient a different kind of rotation on each kind of brick pattern, and that's why we're getting this kind of cool effect. So it almost looks like we have some kind of broken bricks and they're coming up from the ground or something like that. This might be a little too aggressive, as in it's just extruded too much. So what I like to do personally is just take a blend node. I'm going to set my regular pattern at the bottom, and then just going to take this guy, and I'm just going to set it to opacity on a copy, and then we're just going to plug this guy in and kind of see what's going on. So that's something, this is a little bit more doable, and we can kind of go through the different, if we set this back to 1, we can actually go through the different values, and you can kind of see the different effects that it does, or the different blend nodes, and you can kind of see the different effects that it does. So one cool thing that you'll notice when we do an add, it looks like the kind of the pattern is actually getting chipped away, almost like if we were sculpting it in ZBrush or something like that. And this is kind of a cool effect that we can also get with the gradient node, but we can actually push this further even more if we wanted to. So one way to do that is we can actually start chaining these guys a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to unplug this guy and just put it back so we can kind of see our default. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take another flood fill here, going to duplicate it, and I'm just going to set the random seed to something different. So we do have the angle variation at 1, but because we have a random seed, we can actually just move it up or down, and we'll get a different result from our last node. Now what we can do from here is that we can take a blend node, and I'm just going to blend these two together, and we can go through the different kind of blend modes, and we can actually use the min darken is a good one. So already with the min darken, you can kind of see what's going on. We're getting the gradient from 2 different positions, and so one gradient's coming in from this way, one gradient's coming in from this way, and we're getting this nice kind of hard cut here, and it's happening on every single one of these bricks. So what we can do is, let me just delete this guy right here. Let's just plug this in and see what we're getting. So now we're getting kind of like this chiseled look on these stones, but again, it doesn't stop here. We can actually just duplicate these guys. So I'm just going to do a duplicate. I'm going to take this gradient, move the random seed. I'm going to take this guy, because we already have on our node. We're going to add a third cut in here, so you can kind of see what's going on. So you can actually keep kind of chaining these guys on more and more, and we're going to start getting this kind of nice chiseled chip effect, which is really cool. And again, if we wanted to, if we thought this wasn't kind of what we want, we can actually just bring this guy in and then blend it into here. And then we can mess with the different blend modes and see what kind of effects we get. So right here on this one, we did it on an add. So now we're going to get some more kind of chiseled look on these guys. So it looks like we're kind of beating down the corners. And what's nice is that we're getting like enough variation that it's not hitting all of these guys, but just a few of them. So it's giving us some nice kind of variation within this tiling pattern. Now let's go over some other ways we can use this guy. The cool thing about the flood fill is that you pretty much only have to create one for said pattern that you're using, and you could just plug in whichever other nodes into this guy that you want. Now let's go back into this original tile generator. Now we added these different grayscale values within the actual node itself because we had the luminance random and whatnot. Now if we had a pattern that we created with different tile generators and all that, we might not have the ability to add this grayscale value into said pattern. So for example, let's just take this tile generator, and I'm going to actually turn off the luminance random on this guy. Now, say we had something super intricate where we didn't have this option, or even in the tile generator, we just didn't have the option. The cool thing about the flood fill is that we're able to introduce grayscale values into your original pattern, because within the different list of flood fill nodes that we have one that's called flood fill to grayscale. And it's exactly the name, it's exactly as the name says. We're going to get some grayscale values from our flood fill and our original pattern. So if we plug in this guy, we can start messing with the different luminance random values. And you can kind of see that we're starting to get some just by adjusting this guy. So in my opinion, it gives you a little bit more control than just adding different grayscale values within the actual tile generator. But it's also a great way to add just some different variation on a tiling pattern that might not have the ability to do that within the generator. So just keep that in mind in case you wanted to add some variation into a pattern. So now that we have this, we can actually just do a blend on this guy. I'm going to take our original pattern, going to take our new grayscale values, and then we're just going to do an opacity, and then we're able to kind of control how strong and how light these guys are, which is really nice. So, and the cool thing about this is you'll notice, so here's a great example actually. When we did the add on this guy, because we added this flood fill, you'll notice that we lost all the different grayscale values from this guy, which, you know, maybe you want these grayscale values while still having this nice kind of edge chipping. What we can do is kind of do the same thing. I'm just going to duplicate this guy over here, and I'm just going to plug the flood fill node into here. I'm going to take our original pattern, and now we have these nice values. What we can do here is add a blend. I'm going to plug this guy in, plug this on the top. Just lower the opacity. And not only do we have those original grayscale values, but we also have the chipping from the original kind of edge chipping with the flood filter gradient that we were doing. So we can just plug this guy in. And now we have the different kind of height values within the bricks, but we also have some nice chipping going on too. And again, we don't have to just keep it on the copy if we want. We can actually just go through the different values and see what we got. So maybe a different mode works better. Like this one, we're able to keep these nice hard edges, but we're also bringing in the full on spectrum of the grayscale values. So this is kind of giving us a cool effect here. One of my favorite uses for the flood fill node is being able to add some overlays and some variation onto our tiling pattern. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. So a lot of people, when they add overlays, they usually bring them in. So for example, I'm just going to bring in one of these grunge maps that we have within Substance Designer. And I'm just going to do a blend right here. So I'm just going to blend this guy in. And I'm just going to set it to something like, you know what? Let's actually bring a grunge map that's kind of more like, for example, this guy. This guy has an overlaying kind of full-on continuous pattern on this guy, so we have the streaks going on. So I'm just going to plug this guy in. I'm going to set the opacity down to something like this, and let's plug this guy in. So a lot of people right now, they'd probably call it done and kind of you know, keep this, probably mess with the opacity just a little bit more so it's not as strong, but still have that pattern. So the thing about this pattern is that this kind of grunge overlay is a continuous streaking going on the vertical kind of plane. Now, the one thing you'll notice is that it seems kind of odd for the streaking to be kind of going all the same direction on, say, if this was a floor pattern or something like that. Maybe you might want that, but I'd like to give this some more variation. So what if we wanted, let's say, the grunge going in all different directions? Kind of like we had in the flood filter gradient, we had the ability to change the angle variation so we can switch it up. What if we had the ability to do that within a grunge or anything you overlay, for example? So one cool way to do that is we can actually bring in a, let's do a flood fill to random color. So when you plug this guy in, you're going to get some random colors, which is kind of it might seem a little weird, but this is a great mask to be used in conjunction with the vector warp node. So I'm just going to bring in a vector warp node right now, and I'm just going to do vector warp grayscale. The grayscale gives us the ability to still plug in our original grayscale input, but the vector map is actually looking for a color here. So what we can do here is just plug in any grayscale that we want. We're going to plug in this flood fill to random color as our vector map. And instantly you can kind of see what's happening here. All the different colors are giving it a different direction to take this grunge and just kind of move it in a different direction. So for example, if we had that, you can kind of see how it starts breaking up the pattern. So I'm just going to plug this guy in. And that just gives us a little bit more variation. It's not as kind of just throwing on a simple grunge and just kind of calling it done. This actually moves the different patterns, so we have different kind of overlays within each brick, and it's not just a continuous overlay. So I'm just going to plug this guy in and just mess with the opacity. One cool way to use this would be if we had created cracks. So I'm just going to bring in a cells and kind of show you guys that. So I'm just going to do a cells 1, bring up the scale, and I'm just going to do an edge detect. So I'm just going to pretend these are like some cracks that I created here. Now, if we overlaid these said cracks onto here, it might look weird because all the cracks are interconnecting, and that's just not necessarily how it would happen in the real world. So the cool thing about this vector warp that we have is that it changes position of each different kind of area of the cracks. So now we have something that's a little bit more believable, and they're not as connected or conjoined, so we get a more natural feeling on this. Now, we have these cracks, or let's say if we just kept this grunge map, and but the one thing I'm not liking is that we have them placed all over the place. So how can we kind of fix this? The cool thing is, again, with the flood fill node, we have another node that can help us with that. So we can actually bring in the random grayscale onto this guy, and we can plug the flood fill into here. And what this does is it essentially does the same as this grayscale, but without the kind of parameters and sliders that we can manipulate here. So with this one, it's just going to give you straight up just random grayscale values, as the name implies. But the cool thing about this guy is that we can actually bring in a histogram select. And with this histogram select, we can actually bump up the contrast, and we can start messing with the position and range. So this gives us a nice black and white mask that we can use as an alpha to tell the blend, okay, I only want this certain grunge or cracks or wherever in certain areas of my texture. So we can actually go back into our position. We can, if we want, we can mess where these cracks are. It's kind of a random effect, or we can just kind of bring down the range and say, oh, I only want them in a few different spots. So this already is giving us way more control on the variation that we have within our overlays of our texture. And again, like I said, the cool thing about this is that all I'm doing is just using a single flood fill. You don't have to necessarily go in and duplicate this 4 times to whichever one flood fill you want to use. You can consistently keep using the same flood fill, especially if your pattern is staying the same the whole time. You just don't need to bring in more than one flood fill. Now, let's say we're happy with our current kind of pattern and whatnot. But what if we wanted to do something crazy like adding another pattern within our pattern? So let's say we wanted to add like a specific kind of, I don't know, we could do bolts, we could do just another tiling grid pattern. What if we wanted to do that? So the great thing, again, the flood fill has another node that can help us with that, and that is the flood fill mapper grayscale. What this guy does is we can plug in our original pattern, and then under the pattern input 1, that is where we're going to just plug in our shape or whatever we want to kind of tile on said pattern. So for example, I'm just going to bring in a random tile generator here. And I'm just going to set it to the default values, or just keep it at the default values of the square cubes. And we plug this into our pattern 1, and instantly within the 2D view, you can kind of see what's going on. It's taking this pattern and it's applying it onto every single one brick that we have within this texture. So let's actually blend this guy in, kind of see what the effect it gives us here. I'm going to set this to something like maybe multiply and just set it to something 0. And there we go. Say we wanted like a grid on these guys for some reason. We have that ability to do that. And the cool thing about the mapper is that we do have a few different options that we can play with. So we can play with the scale of these guys, of how much like the pattern is in there. So, you know, it's still kind of keeping true to the underlying bricks, but it's just messing with the actual grid that you have plugged in here. So I'm just going to set that back here. And we can actually bump this up to like a 2 or something. And we don't necessarily have to just have one tiling pattern. It kind of works the same way as the tile sampler, where we're able to continuously bring up the different pattern inputs. So let's say on this guy, we want to do, I don't know, like a disk or something. So let's go ahead and do that, like a disk. Plug this guy into here. And now we have these kind of disk patterns on this guy. So this is kind of cool. So there are ways to add, like, say we wanted just, for example, bolts around this guy. This would be a great way to add kind of, I don't know, like a different tiling pattern on this guy. One cool, interesting technique we can do here is we can actually just bring in a single shape here. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to scale this down just a bit. I'm going to bring in this into pattern 1. Delete this tile generator here. And I'm going to set this flood mapper back down to our original. So we can do something like this. Now from here, what we can do is we can just start messing with the size of this guy. So if we actually just, let me actually keep the scale random off on this guy. And then let's actually set this to subtract. And then I'm going to go back into here. I'm going to change the shape of this guy on the X. So now we have kind of like this intricate, almost like pattern within our bricks. So it's just a nice way to, if we had certain patterns or certain things we see in our reference that we'd like to add onto our already pre-existing bricks, we have the ability to do that. So the last flood fill node that I'd like to show you guys is the flood fill to bounding box size. Now, what this guy does is that it takes the size of the different shapes in your original tiling pattern, and it makes a mask, a grayscale mask based on that. So for example, if we plug in the flood fill of this guy, it's going to give us a mask depending on the size of the different shapes that we have within our tiling pattern. So if you notice, these bricks are actually slightly bigger than these, or vice versa. We can change the X if we want. So this is a nice way to actually create a mask based on the size of certain bricks within your pattern. So for example, we can take again our histogram select, and we can just bump up the contrast and just kind of plug this guy in. So this is a really quick and easy way to get certain patterns or masks that we can use within our kind of blends that we do. Another great example of this is, let's just take the actual tile generator, and we're actually just going to change the scale on this just slightly. So we're going to go into the settings, we're going to do a scale random, and we're just going to scale some of them just slightly. So we're going to bring in a new flood fill. I'm just going to duplicate this guy, and then maybe this one can kind of illustrate you guys what exactly is happening with this one. So I'm just going to duplicate this one as well, And plug this guy in. And as you see with this is that it's kind of super subtle, but you'll notice that the bigger blocks are actually a wider value than the counterpart of the smaller ones. So it's gradually going from this lighter gray to this darker gray. So if we actually go into our histogram select again, plug this guy in, bump up the contrast, just bring up the range and position. Bring this guy up. We can actually just get a mask for, let me just get it super close here. There we go. We can actually just get a mask for the bricks that are the largest within the pattern, which is sometimes it's useful depending on the tiling pattern that you have. So if we actually kind of bump the random scale on this guy, so we have more kind of different scales on these guys, we can go back into the flood filter bounding box, and you'll notice that we're introducing another grayscale value. So once you kind of go further back, you can kind of see the darker areas and the lighter areas. But this is just a great way to get just another mask. So if we wanted to go into our blend and we only wanted like certain kind of characteristics on the larger bricks, whereas the smaller bricks don't get that, we could go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to use this guy as a blend, and let's go ahead and just add some more cracks onto this guy, and we're only going to put them on the vertical planes, I believe. Yeah, so now the cracks are only on these guys. So it's a really quick and easy way to just get cracks on certain areas depending on the size. So let's bring down the opacity on this guy, and let's actually turn these guys off so we can kind of better see what's going on here. So now, as you can see, only the cracks are going with every other line within the pattern, which is really cool. And that about covers the main uses of the flood fill node. We were able to get a bunch of different customization into our tiling textures with the different gradients, masks, and colors that we introduced within our flood fill. So it's a nice way to just kind of push what we already have within our tiling patterns and just kind of give them a little bit more uniqueness to them. I hope you guys found this useful, and stay tuned for more tutorials on this channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.